outline's done, I can now start working on the underpainting. This is supposed to guide the final stage or the final layer, and it's going to be the last acrylic layer that I apply on this canvas. I use acrylic for this stage mainly because it dries really fast, and this is important because it means I won't have to spend too much time waiting for a preparatory stage to fully dry. The job of the underpainting is to show me the relationship between the different shades and tints in the painting, in other words, where the shadows and highlights will appear. And depending on your style, you can also use the underpainting a bit cleverly. Sometimes an artist may want to leave some parts of the painting untouched with the final layer, and in such cases, if your underpainting is colored, then it won't be so easy for the casual viewer to tell which parts have been painted on with the final layer and which parts haven't, at least not by using the colors alone. So it's maybe the details that can give you away, but as far as the colors are concerned, if the underpainting is colored, it could very well appear as though it's part of the final layer. I personally don't use the underpainting to mask any spaces that I'll leave in the final layer because I don't leave any. But depending on your style, let's say if you're an impressionist, such a tip could come in handy every once in a while. I don't need this layer to have a lot of detail, which will explain the relatively large brushes that I'm using for it. My main aim at this stage is to fully cover the grey background and see for the first time what the painting will likely look like, at least as a monochrome. A monochrome in this case is an artwork that's been done using one color, which is how I make my underpaintings, a departure from how I used to paint them from around 2015 to 2019. The difficulty I was facing back then with these full color underpaintings was that since the underpaintings were made in the exact same colors that the final layer would end up having, it would be quite difficult for me to tell in the final layer which parts I had painted on with oils and which parts still had the acrylic underpainting showing. And it only took me about 100 paintings of going through this before the idea struck me to just create the underpaintings in one color. Even then, it's still better if the underpainting is done in a monochrome that's of a color that won't appear in the final layer, which is something that I'm about to learn the hard way in this very painting, as you'll see. By now you can probably already see some similarities and differences between my painting and Leonardo's drawing. The main difference in my view, of course, being that the painting is not exactly a carbon copy of the drawing, which is how I tend to use the drawings or the sketches that I make. They inform or inspire the way the models will pose, but during shooting we may discover with the models or the photographer different or better ways to simulate the poses that I sketched. When creating the underpainting, I don't need to start with the background, followed by the middle ground and finally the foreground as I do with the final layer. Especially when painting a portrait, the most important thing for me at this stage is to get the contrasts in the face or the hands or any other parts of exposed skin represented quite well on canvas before anything else. Then the colors that everything else will have, be it the blouse in this case, or if there was a background, be it that background, would have to be worked around the colors or the hues that the main character has. And so in this case, for instance, since I've started with her hands, the color of those hands will determine how dark or how bright the skirt or the blouse will be. Had I started with those other parts of the painting, I would have ended up having to compromise the skin color of the model, since I usually have to balance different parts of the painting with each other. And since the sitter is the main part of any portrait, I would much rather always do it the other way around, where it's everything else that's adjusted to fit into what the main character looks like. Another important rule or consideration in the underpainting, at least in the way I do it, is that my monochrome doesn't go to either extremes of that gradient. So if I'm using this brown monochrome, for instance, the darkest color on my palette won't be black and the brightest one in it won't be white. The logic behind this is similar to how I said earlier that it's better to use colors in the underpainting that won't appear in the final layer. And in this case, if I use black or white and these two colors will appear in the final layer, this means I would end up running into the same problems that I used to have with my underpaintings back when I started. And so the darkest color in this monochrome is something close to burnt umber, and the brightest one is white mixed with a bit of that burnt umber. For a painting of this size, the underpainting usually takes about a day to complete, and since I'm using acrylics, which again dry rapidly, this means I'll have to mix the colors over and over at least a couple of times within that day. I wouldn't have this problem if I was creating my underpaintings in oils, but the problem with oils is they take 2 or 3 days to dry, so it's a bit of a trade-off. And weighing the two, I'd much rather mix my colors afresh a few times but end up finishing my underpainting in less than a day than not having to mix the colors a few times within that day but end up waiting 2 or 3 days for the oil underpainting to dry before I can move on to the final layer. I also simplify my underpainting into a gradient of 5 shades or tints of the same color, and by blending these together on canvas before they dry, I'm able to create smooth gradients, which make the painting look a bit less like a vector painting. And after doing this for a few hours, I now have myself an underpainting. The next step will be the final layer, and everything from here on out will be painted using oils. Acrylics are perfect for the previous layers.